In the chilling December of 1942, high above the treacherous Solomon Islands, a young man of 19, Eddie Kowalski, served as a waist gunner aboard a B-17 Flying Fortress. His hands, firm and resolute, gripped the powerful Browning M2 machine gun, which vibrated intensely like a pneumatic drill against his frame. Suddenly, a Japanese Zero fighter materialized at his 10 o'clock position, approximately 300 yards distant, slicing across his field of vision from left to right with the swiftness of a thrown dart. Eddie, driven by every primal instinct, meticulously aligned his crosshairs directly onto the enemy aircraft's fuselage and unleashed a torrent of 50 rounds. He watched, transfixed, as the tracer fire arced through the vast expanse of air, every single bullet passing harmlessly behind the Zero's tail. The Japanese pilot, seemingly oblivious or perhaps unconcerned, did not even execute evasive maneuvers, continuing his trajectory completely untouched while Eddie's ammunition counter relentlessly dwindled towards zero. This unfortunate outcome was not a testament to Eddie's personal failing. Rather, it was a scenario that tragically replayed itself thousands of times across every theater of World War II during those initial, desperate years. American gunners, despite being meticulously trained, highly motivated, and equipped with what were considered the finest machine guns ever manufactured, were consistently missing their targets, not just occasionally, but ceaselessly. A comprehensive study was undertaken by the Army Air Forces in early 1943, meticulously analyzing gun camera footage from numerous bomber missions conducted over both European and Pacific skies. The revelations from this investigation were nothing short of catastrophic. Highly trained aerial gunners were achieving dismal hit rates, consistently falling below a mere 4% when engaging crossing targets. This shockingly low figure of 4% meant that for every 100 rounds discharged at an enemy aircraft moving perpendicularly to the gunner's position, an astounding 96 bullets were simply dissipating into the empty air. The mathematical implications were stark and brutal. A typical aerial engagement, characterized by its fleeting nature, might endure for a brief 8 to 12 seconds before the enemy fighter either broke off its attack or moved beyond effective range. The Browning M2, a formidable weapon, boasted a firing rate of approximately 800 rounds per minute, translating to about 13 rounds per second. Therefore, within a 10-second engagement, a gunner could theoretically propel 130 rounds into the atmosphere. With a mere 4% hit rate, this grim arithmetic implied that only about 5 bullets might actually connect with the intended target. Crucially, 5 hits were demonstrably insufficient to bring down a nimble Zero, let alone a more robust and heavily armored aircraft like the German Focke-Wulf FW-190, which could absorb substantial damage and continue its fight. German and Japanese fighter planes demonstrated an alarming capacity to withstand multiple hits from .50 caliber rounds, often continuing their flight despite significant damage. The human toll exacted by this deficiency was staggering. In 1943 alone, the 8th Air Force, conducting its perilous operations over Europe, suffered an average loss of 188 bombers each month. Given that each B-17 carried a crew of 10 men, this translated to a horrifying total of 1,880 airmen killed, captured, or missing every 30 days. A substantial proportion of these devastating losses stemmed directly from bomber formations that found themselves unable to effectively defend against persistent fighter attacks. The gunners, through no fault of their own, were diligently adhering to every aspect of their rigorous training, tracking the target with precision, maintaining a clear sight picture, and carefully controlling their bursts of fire. The fundamental issue was not a lack of courage or commitment on their part. Rather, the insurmountable obstacle was the unforgiving laws of physics. And physics, it was brutally clear, held no regard for human bravery. Please stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Please also write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. Every gunner, driven by an innate human reflex, instinctively aimed directly at the visible target. This approach, logical and intuitive, seemed to make perfect sense. One points at the object intended for impact, pulls the trigger, and expects the object to be struck. Such a straightforward logic functions flawlessly when engaging a stationary target on a rifle range or even when pursuing a deer moving at a modest 20 miles per hour. However, enemy fighter aircraft were emphatically not deer. They were hurtling across the gunner's field of view at speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour. Some of the advanced, late-war models, such as the formidable Me-262 jet, could attain blistering speeds of up to 540 miles per hour. At these extraordinary velocities, the minute interval required for a bullet to traverse the distance from the gun muzzle to the target's position meant that by the time the projectile arrived, the target was simply no longer there. The bullet itself, expelled from the barrel of a Browning M2, traveled at an impressive speed of approximately 2,900 feet per second. This velocity sounds almost instantaneous, and indeed, at very short ranges against slow-moving targets, it effectively was. Yet, in the unforgiving arena of aerial combat, short range typically implied distances of 200 to 400 yards, and the targets were screaming through the sky at speeds that would have been deemed utterly impossible just 2 decades prior. Consider a Japanese Zero, flying at 300 miles per hour, which covers a distance of 440 feet every single second. Performing the calculation for a 300-yard shot, which equates to 900 feet, and factoring in the bullet's speed of 2,900 feet per second, the bullet required approximately 0.31 seconds to bridge that distance. This duration might seem negligible, yet in those mere 0.31 seconds, that Zero would have advanced an additional 136 feet, a distance equivalent to 11 car lengths. The gunner, tragically, aimed at the aircraft's current location, but the bullet arrived at the position the aircraft had occupied a third of a second earlier, passing through empty air while the enemy fighter continued its trajectory, completely unscathed. This critical phenomenon was accurately termed deflection error. Military scientists possessed a theoretical understanding of this principle long before the outbreak of World War II, but comprehending a concept in a classroom setting and effectively resolving it in the maelstrom of combat were two entirely disparate challenges. The required deflection was not a minor, subtle adjustment. It was a massive, counterintuitive compensation. Against a target crossing at a precise 90-degree angle at a distance of 300 yards, a gunner needed to aim approximately 15 to 20 feet ahead of the aircraft's nose. This necessitated placing the crosshairs on what appeared to be completely empty sky, relying entirely on the expectation that the target would subsequently fly into the projected stream of bullets. Every human instinct, however, vehemently rebelled against such an action. Gunnery instructors diligently attempted to impart deflection shooting techniques during training, but the practical results were consistently dismal. The Army Air Force's Flexible Gunnery School, located in Laredo, Texas, implemented rigorous training programs starting in 1942. Trainees spent countless hours within turret simulators, practiced shooting at towed targets from moving trucks, and meticulously studied complex diagrams illustrating proper lead angles. Despite these efforts, none of this theoretical and simulated training translated effectively to the brutal realities of actual combat. The core issue lay in the inherent complexity. Deflection was not a singular, fixed calculation. It shifted constantly, influenced by a multitude of variables including target speed, target angle, range, altitude, whether the target was climbing or diving, and even whether the gunner's own aircraft was turning. A B-17 ball turret gunner engaging a Bf-109 performing a frontal attack required a vastly different deflection than the same gunner engaging the same aircraft during a beam attack from the side. And he had, perhaps, a mere 4 seconds to process all these intricate variables while simultaneously enduring enemy fire. As his aircraft bucked violently from flak damage, and as his oxygen mask inevitably fogged up at an altitude of 25,000 feet, the psychological barrier, it became chillingly clear, was just as lethal as the technical one. Gunners who managed to survive their initial few missions and subsequently attempted to implement deflection shooting often abandoned the technique after experiencing apparent failures. They would aim ahead of a target, discharge a burst of ammunition, observe their tracers arcing through the seemingly empty sky in front of the enemy plane, and erroneously conclude that they had led the target too much. Consequently, in the very next engagement, they would instinctively reduce their lead, shifting their aim point closer to the visible target. They were, in essence, self-correcting in precisely the wrong direction, trusting their immediate visual perception over the invisible, yet undeniable, laws of physics. Gun camera footage meticulously recorded from 1943 missions repeatedly showcased this tragic pattern, initial bursts exhibiting some forward lead, followed by subsequent bursts that progressively walked backward until the gunner was firing directly at, or even slightly behind, the target's current position. The casualties inevitably mounted to horrifying levels. 8th Air Force records from the devastating October 1943 missions to Schweinfurt revealed a staggering 20% loss rate, with 60 bombers failing to return out of the 291 dispatched. The surviving aircraft landed with dead and wounded crewmen aboard, their hydraulic lines shredded, and their engines trailing ominous plumes of smoke. In the subsequent debriefings, gunners consistently reported the same profound frustration. They had been shooting, their guns had been functioning perfectly, but their bullets had simply not been connecting with the enemy. Something fundamentally had to change, and it had to change with extreme urgency, because at the current, unsustainable loss rates, the Allied bombing campaign was destined to collapse long before it could ever reach Berlin. The pivotal solution, ironically, had been reposing in a dusty filing cabinet since 1924, authored by a man whose name most combat aircrews had never even heard. Lieutenant Colonel James Puckle, not to be confused with the historical Puckle, who invented the defense gun, was an American artillery officer possessing an exceptional aptitude for ballistics. He had published a seminal technical paper titled, "The Problem of Lead in Aerial Gunnery," during his tenure as an instructor at the Army's Field Artillery School. Puckle was far from being a detached, theoretical academic. He was a seasoned veteran who had served in France during World War I, where he had witnessed the first clumsy, yet prophetic, attempts at air-to-air combat. This experience allowed him to presciently recognize that the escalating speeds of aviation were on the cusp of creating a targeting crisis that traditional marksmanship principles would be utterly incapable of solving. His paper meticulously laid out the complex mathematics with brutal and uncompromising clarity. Puckle conclusively demonstrated that as aircraft speeds advanced beyond 150 miles per hour, the required deflection angles would invariably exceed human intuitive capability. He precisely calculated that against a target moving at 250 miles per hour at a perpendicular angle, a gunner would need to aim approximately 4 to 5 aircraft lengths ahead of the visible target. His comprehensive paper included detailed tables, and exhaustive charts delineating the required lead for various combinations of target speed, range, and crossing angle. For instance, a 200-yard shot at a 90-degree crossing angle against a 300 miles per hour target demanded a lead of 47 feet. The identical target at 400 yards necessitated an astonishing lead of 94 feet. The sheer magnitude of these numbers was staggering, and Puckle's ultimate conclusion was even more disturbing. Without the aid of mechanical assistance, aerial gunners would effectively become useless within a mere decade. Regrettably, the Army simply filed his paper away, and promptly forgot about its profound implications. Throughout the dynamic decades of the 1920s and 1930s, military aviation experienced rapid and transformative advancements, yet gunnery training remained stubbornly rooted in antiquated World War I methodologies. Instructors diligently taught fundamental marksmanship principles, sight picture, trigger control, and breath control, as if their students were preparing for a static rifle competition rather than a frantic, three-dimensional chase at 300 miles per hour. The few dissenting voices advocating for advanced deflection training were summarily dismissed as alarmists. After all, the prevailing rationale asserted, Americans had always been renowned for their exceptional marksmanship, citing legendary figures like Daniel Boone and Sergeant York, embodying the frontier tradition of sharpshooting. Surely, it was reasoned, those inherent skills would seamlessly translate to aerial combat with adequate practice. They did not. When the United States formally entered World War II in December 1941, the Army Air Force's gunnery training was catastrophically unprepared for the stark realities of modern air combat. The standard training program lasted a mere 4 weeks. Students fired approximately 1,000 rounds in total throughout their entire qualification course. The vast majority of that limited ammunition was expended on stationary targets and slowly towed sleeves that moved at perhaps 150 miles per hour in highly predictable straight lines. Not a single training scenario adequately replicated the chaotic intensity of an FW-190 diving through a bomber formation at 400 miles per hour while simultaneously executing a barrel roll. Graduates, upon receiving their wings, climbed into bombers, flew to England or the Pacific, and discovered with brutal clarity that their training was utterly worthless the very first time a Japanese Zero or a German fighter flashed across their gun sight. By the middle of 1942, as the global conflict intensified, military commanders found themselves in a desperate search, sifting through historical technical archives for any overlooked insight that might offer an advantage. It was during this critical period that Captain Robert Williams, serving with the 8th Air Force Gunnery Analysis Section, unearthed a prophetic 1924 treatise authored by a man named Puckle, discovered within the venerable archives at Wright Field. Williams, captivated by its contents, consumed the entire paper in a single reading session, subsequently dispatching an urgent memorandum to his commanding officer, notably underscoring 2 words 3 times. He knew. Puckle, with astonishing prescience, had accurately forecast the precise tactical calamity that was now unfolding, nearly 2 decades before the inaugural B-17 bomber ever embarked on a combat sortie over the European theater. His intricate calculations remained entirely valid, and his dire warnings had proven tragically accurate. The grim reality was that countless American air crewmen had perished, victims of a failure to heed these earlier admonitions. The fundamental truth was not whether Puckle's analysis had been correct. The underlying mathematical principles were, in fact, beyond dispute. The pressing concern was whether any practical remedy could still be devised. The notion of training gunners to consciously compute complex deflection angles while simultaneously enduring the extreme pressures of aerial combat seemed utterly unfeasible. The human cognitive process simply could not manage intricate trigonometry at the blistering speeds demanded by such engagements. Yet, if deliberate, analytical calculation was an impossible task, perhaps an alternative, more intuitive approach could be found. Concurrently, across the Atlantic, the British had already begun to forge their own solutions, born from an equally profound sense of desperation during the tumultuous summer of 1940. RAF Squadron 609, operating its formidable Spitfires from the aerodrome at Middle Wallop, grappled with a severe gunnery crisis that strikingly foreshadowed the challenges American bomber crews would confront 2 years later. Despite the unquestionable bravery of their pilots and the inherent magnificence of their aircraft, an unsettling number of their shots were simply failing to connect. Flight Lieutenant John Dundas, meticulously reviewing gun camera footage from engagements throughout July, uncovered a stark reality. His squadron's hit rate against Agile, crossing Messerschmitt Bf 109s hovered dismally around 6%. This meant that for every 100 rounds discharged, a mere 6 found their mark. Considering that a Spitfire carried sufficient ammunition for only approximately 16 seconds of continuous firing, pilots were expending their entire combat load, often with the frustrating experience of watching German fighters return to their bases seemingly unscathed. Squadron leader Horace Darley, the resolute commander of 609 Squadron, took a remarkably bold and unconventional step. In early August 1940, at the very height of the Battle of Britain, a period when every single fighter aircraft was desperately needed in the skies, he made the extraordinary decision to ground his entire unit for 3 full days. During this critical interval, Darley orchestrated a series of live-fire experiments that directly contradicted nearly every established tenet within the RAF's official training manuals. Having been an accomplished competitive clay pigeon shooter prior to the war, Darley possessed a unique understanding of how to effectively lead moving targets, a crucial insight that military theorists had largely overlooked. He recognized that the most proficient shotgun shooters did not engage in conscious mathematical calculations to determine lead. Instead, they instinctively felt it. Their brains processed the target's trajectory and velocity at a subconscious level, guiding their hands to position the barrel ahead of the clay disc without any deliberate intellectual computation. Darley pondered whether fighter pilots could cultivate this same instinctive, reactive response. His experimental design was brutally straightforward. A Hurricane fighter would tow a target banner across the designated gunnery range, while his Spitfire pilots executed repeated firing passes. However, instead of adhering to the standard approach, where pilots meticulously aimed and attempted to calculate the precise lead angle, Darley issued an instruction that, to many, sounded utterly irrational. Do not aim at all. Instead, focus entirely on the target's movement. Allow your eyes to track its path and commence firing while your aircraft is still in the process of turning to follow. Permit the necessary deflection to occur naturally through the inherent motion of your turn, rather than endeavoring to consciously generate it with precise aiming adjustments. Discharge your weapons into the space where your instincts tell you the target will be, not where your eyes currently perceive it to be. We sincerely invite you to stay with us and watch the conclusion of this insightful video. Your likes and subscriptions are deeply appreciated, and we encourage you to share your thoughts in the comments below, letting us know where you are from and what you think about the compelling topic presented. The initial attempts at this radical new method were, predictably, nothing short of disastrous. Pilots consistently missed the towed banner by as much as 50 feet, their streams of bullets merely stitching erratic patterns across an empty expanse of sky. Undeterred, Darley compelled them to repeat the exercise relentlessly, with each pilot executing 40 passes over the course of the 3-day period. There were no lengthy lectures on ballistics, no complex trigonometry lessons, and no cumbersome tables of deflection angles, only persistent repetition coupled with one singular, simple directive. Fire while you are still moving, not after you have steadied on target. By the third day, a truly remarkable transformation began to manifest. The pilots' hit rates, though not soaring dramatically, started to noticeably climb. They progressed from a meager 6% to approximately 12%. This seemingly modest doubling, however, carried profound implications, translating directly into twice as many bullets striking German aircraft, which in turn meant twice as many enemy kills or, at the very least, twice as many damaged enemy fighters compelled to return to base, rendered incapable of flying subsequent missions. Darley meticulously documented his findings and formally submitted them to Fighter Command Headquarters on August 18, 1940. His comprehensive report contained a particularly crucial observation. The pilots who demonstrated the most rapid improvement were not necessarily those who had achieved the highest marksmanship scores during peacetime. Rather, they were the individuals who possessed the innate ability to suppress their ingrained instinct to aim with careful precision, choosing instead to trust their peripheral vision and their intuitive sense of motion. The conscious brain, Darley argued with conviction, was simply too sluggish for the dynamic, high-speed environment of modern aerial combat. The true solution, he posited, lay in training the subconscious mind to autonomously manage the complex problem of deflection, much in the same way a baseball player's brain instinctively calculates the landing point of a flyball without consciously solving intricate trajectory equations. Fighter Command subsequently circulated Darley's groundbreaking findings, yet the implementation of his techniques proved to be scattered and inconsistent. While some squadrons embraced the new methodology with enthusiastic conviction, others summarily dismissed it as unscientific nonsense. The RAF's training command, in particular, exhibited significant resistance. Their instructors had accumulated decades of experience in teaching the fundamental principles of marksmanship, and Darley's unconventional approach appeared to abandon everything they understood about proper shooting discipline. Nevertheless, the irrefutable evidence of combat results spoke for itself. Squadrons that actively adopted motion-based deflection shooting consistently demonstrated measurably superior kill ratios throughout the autumn of 1940. The empirical data was sufficiently compelling that by early 1941, the technique was quietly but steadily becoming standard operational practice, even if the official training manuals had yet to formally incorporate these revolutionary changes. American military observers stationed in Britain diligently recorded detailed notes regarding Darley's innovative methods. However, the United States Army Air Forces confronted a fundamentally different challenge. While fighter pilots could potentially acquire instinctive deflection skills through rigorous repetition, bomber gunners were positioned in a vastly different operational context. A Spitfire pilot possessed complete control over his entire aircraft, skillfully utilizing its motion and angles to generate natural lead. In stark contrast, a waist gunner aboard a B-17 bomber stood in a fixed position within an aircraft that typically flew straight and level through intense anti-aircraft fire, completely unable to maneuver or employ the aircraft's movement to achieve deflection. His operational control was limited solely to his hands on the gun and his eyes on the target. If conscious calculation proved too slow, and instinctive motion was simply not an available option, then the only viable solution had to be a mechanical one. This pressing need led to the involvement of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, specifically the establishment of the Radiation Laboratories Division 7 in early 1942. The name, Radiation Laboratory, was a deliberate and clever misdirection, designed to suggest atomic research, thereby maintaining a high degree of secrecy around the division's actual mandate: the development of sophisticated fire control systems. At the helm of this crucial division was Dr. Charles Stark Draper, a brilliant 40-year-old engineer who had dedicated the preceding decade to pioneering gyroscopic instruments for aircraft navigation. Draper possessed a profound understanding that the deflection problem was not, at its core, a question of mere shooting accuracy. Instead, it was fundamentally a challenge of precise prediction. A truly effective gun sight, he realized, needed to indicate to the gunner not merely where the target was located in the present moment, but rather where the target would definitively be positioned by the time the projectiles actually reached it. The Mark 14 computing gun sight emerged from Dr. Draper's laboratory in its prototype form by July 1943, appearing to all who saw it as something plucked directly from the pages of science fiction. It comprised a sophisticated reflector sight intricately linked to a robust gyroscope system, weighing a substantial 28 pounds and necessitating electrical power derived from the aircraft's generator system. The gunner operated this advanced device through a mechanical ranging control. By rotating a dial, he would align a set of internal reference marks with the target's wingspan, thereby providing the sight with the essential range information it required. Following this, he would track the target for approximately 2 seconds, meticulously keeping it centered within a small tracking circle. During this brief, critical interval, the integrated gyroscope precisely measured the target's angular velocity, that is, how rapidly it was traversing the gunner's field of view. It was at this juncture that the Mark 14 truly distinguished itself as remarkable. Its internal mechanism, a complex network of cams and gears, functioned as an analog computer, meticulously crafted from machine metal, capable of solving the intricate deflection equation in real time. It seamlessly integrated the range input provided by the gunner, the angular velocity data from the gyroscope, and the known ballistic properties of the .50 caliber round. From these inputs, it precisely calculated how far ahead of the target the guns needed to be aimed. The result was displayed as a luminous reticle that appeared to float in space, positioned accurately ahead of the target aircraft. The gunner no longer aimed directly at the enemy plane. Instead, he aimed at this glowing dot. And, provided he had correctly ranged the target and maintained smooth tracking, that illuminated dot indicated the exact point of impact. The Mark 14 was capable of solving mathematical problems that would take a human brain several minutes to complete using pencil and paper, and it executed these complex equations 30 times per second, continuously updating its calculations as the target's angle and range dynamically changed. Initial testing conducted at the Naval Air Station in Norfolk, Virginia, during August 1943, yielded results that bordered on the seemingly impossible. Gunners, who had previously struggled to achieve hit rates better than a mere 5% against challenging crossing targets, immediately experienced a dramatic leap to 18% with the Mark 14. And this impressive improvement was observed on their very first day of using the system. After just 1 week of dedicated practice, these rates climbed even higher, consistently exceeding 25%. This represented a staggering 5-fold improvement over traditional manual aiming methods, a statistical enhancement that directly translated into 5 times as many enemy aircraft being damaged or destroyed per engagement. However, the monumental task of manufacturing and subsequently installing tens of thousands of Mark 14 sights across the entire bomber fleet would demand a significant amount of time, a luxury the Allied forces simply did not possess. Meaningful production numbers did not commence until early 1944, and installation priority was naturally given to new aircraft rolling off the assembly lines, rather than undertaking the costly and time-consuming process of retrofitting existing bombers already in service. This meant that the vast majority of gunners flying missions throughout late 1943 and early 1944 were still reliant on basic iron sights, or rudimentary reflector sights, that lacked any computing capability. They urgently required an immediate solution, one that could be implemented without waiting for advanced new technology or necessitating extensive electrical modifications to their aircraft. They needed a practical technique that could be effectively utilized with the equipment they already possessed. The eventual breakthrough, unexpectedly, did not originate from the minds of engineers or scientists, but rather from the combat gunners themselves, particularly those serving in the Pacific Theater, where engagement distances and visibility conditions were often considerably better than over the frequently cloud-covered skies of Europe. The European theater of war, by March 1944, presented an increasingly perilous landscape for Allied air crews. Amidst this backdrop, Staff Sergeant William "Bill" Fleming, a dedicated waist gunner assigned to the USS Lexington's Air Group Support Staff, had already distinguished himself through an extraordinary record of service. By this pivotal point in the conflict, Fleming had participated in a remarkable 31 combat missions, enduring and surviving for separate instances where his aircraft was lost, a testament to his resilience in the face of extreme danger. Despite his lack of formal military commission or a university education, and possessing no theoretical understanding of complex aeronautical principles such as gyroscopic precession, Fleming's practical combat acumen was undeniable. He had discharged an estimated 40,000 rounds of ammunition in hostile engagements and personally confirmed hits on 7 enemy aircraft. Crucially, during his extensive combat experience, he meticulously maintained a personal notebook, which would soon prove to be an invaluable asset. Within the pages of Fleming's modest notebook lay an extraordinary innovation: detailed sketches of adversary aircraft, each accompanied by hand-drawn lines extending forward from their noses. These visual annotations precisely indicated the leading edge where Fleming had consciously aimed his fire during successful aerial encounters. He devised a remarkably intuitive system for quantifying these lead distances, calibrating them against the length of the target aircraft itself. For instance, 2 plane lengths ahead for a moderate deflection, or 3 plane lengths forward for a more acute crossing shot. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Please write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. This groundbreaking methodology came to the attention of naval leadership on March 14, 1944, when Fleming presented his notebook during a routine debriefing session to Lieutenant Commander Edward "Butch" O'Hare. O'Hare, a Distinguished Medal of Honor recipient and widely regarded as one of the Navy's most brilliant tacticians, immediately grasped the profound significance of Fleming's observations. He recognized them as genuine empirical deflection data, painstakingly compiled under the authentic and demanding crucible of real combat conditions. Recognizing the immense potential, O'Hare promptly directed Fleming to initiate a comprehensive training regimen for every gunner within the air group. This was no ordinary series of classroom lectures. Instead, it comprised practical, hands-on exercises centered around a straightforward yet revolutionary approach that quickly earned the moniker "spot shooting method." Fleming orchestrated these sessions by positioning gunners at their combat stations, while another crew member traversed the flight deck, presenting a model aircraft affixed to a pole. As this simulated target moved past at various angles, Fleming meticulously coached the gunners, instructing them to visually extend their aim forward by specific, easily quantifiable increments: 1 aircraft length for targets at slight crossing angles, 2 lengths for those at moderate angles, and 3 or more for challenging steep crossing shots. The core genius of this technique resided in furnishing gunners with an immediately memorable and applicable visual reference, the simple directive to count plane lengths forward from the target's nose, then initiate fire. Initially, the Lexington's gunnery officer harbored a degree of skepticism regarding this unconventional method. However, driven by a pressing need for any viable solution to improve gunnery accuracy, he granted authorization for controlled testing. These trials were conducted during the carrier's operational deployment off Truck Lagoon in late March 1944. The officer meticulously gathered data on ammunition expenditure and confirmed hits from the preceding 8 weeks, establishing a baseline. He then rigorously monitored the same metrics following the implementation of Fleming's innovative training program. The subsequent results unequivocally dispelled any lingering doubts. Prior to the introduction of Fleming's training, the Air Group's gunners recorded an average of 4.2 hits for every 100 rounds fired against crossing targets. By the close of April, a mere 6 weeks after the adoption of the spot shooting method, this efficiency rate had surged dramatically to 9.1 hits per 100 rounds. This remarkable improvement signified that the technique had more than doubled the gunners' combat effectiveness, profoundly altering their capacity to engage enemy aircraft. News of this highly effective method disseminated throughout the Pacific Fleet with astonishing rapidity. By May 1944, adapted versions of Fleming's spot shooting technique were being incorporated into the training protocols aboard other prominent carriers, including the Essex, Enterprise, and Bunker Hill. While the gunnery officers on each vessel introduced their own minor refinements, the fundamental principle remained constant: to equip gunners with an uncomplicated visual measurement system directly correlated to the target's apparent size, thereby obviating the necessity for complex, conscious calculations. A gunner was freed from the burden of understanding that he was compensating for 0.3 seconds of bullet flight time. His sole requirement was to instinctively recall 3 plane lengths forward for a crossing shot. The inherent efficacy of this technique stemmed from its profound alignment with the natural processes of human visual perception. Our brains possess an exceptional aptitude for relative size comparison, yet they are notoriously inept at estimating absolute distances without immediate reference points. Instructing a gunner to lead by 50 feet proved meaningless when he lacked any tangible visual cue for what 50 feet looked like at a range of 300 yards. In stark contrast, the directive to lead by 2 plane lengths provided an instant, concrete visual standard that could be applied without conscious deliberation. The very zero he was tracking served as its own inherent measuring stick. The gunner merely needed to project that measurement forward into the empty space ahead of the target. By mid-1944, the Army Air Forces had also embraced similar training methodologies, though they designated their version as radius of action shooting. Technical manuals began to feature illustrative diagrams depicting appropriate lead distances, now expressed as multiples of the target's wingspan or fuselage length. The 8th Air Force Gunnery School, situated at Lavenham, England, completely restructured its entire training curriculum around this technique during June 1944. Consequently, mission loss rates, while still a significant concern, began to exhibit a discernible decline. Data from July 1944 revealed bomber losses of 3.4% per mission, a notable improvement compared to the 5.2% recorded the previous October. This seemingly small statistical difference translated into hundreds of aircrew members returning home safely rather than perishing over German territory. However, merely understanding the technique and successfully executing it under the extreme duress of combat conditions presented 2 entirely distinct and formidable challenges. The human brain, even when equipped with a sophisticated spot shooting method, frequently struggled against its own fundamental impulses once the engagement commenced. Psychologists embedded within the Army Air Forces extensively documented this pervasive phenomenon throughout 1944 through in-depth interviews with returning gunners. The core problem was not a deficiency in knowledge. Gunners could flawlessly articulate the correct lead distances during post-mission debriefings. The critical issue was that this conscious knowledge tended to evaporate under intense stress, supplanted by a primal instinctual urge that relentlessly commanded, "Aim directly at the threat." Captain Harold Klein, an Army psychologist stationed at Bovington, undertook a meticulous study of this involuntary response. His research involved a comprehensive analysis of gun camera footage, meticulously paired with post-mission interviews. Through this process, he identified a distinct pattern which he termed threat fixation collapse. This phenomenon manifested as gunners initially employing proper deflection techniques at the outset of an engagement. However, as the enemy fighter closed in and the perceived level of danger intensified, their aiming point would progressively drift backward until they were firing directly at or even behind the target aircraft. Klein's empirical data demonstrated that this collapse occurred most rapidly during head-on attacks, where the closing speed between the bomber and the attacking fighter exceeded 500 miles per hour, leaving the gunner with perhaps only 2 seconds before the enemy opened fire. Under such extreme psychological pressure, rational technique dissolved into pure, unthinking reaction. Simply point at the terrifying object and pull the trigger. The only viable remedy for this psychological barrier was a regimen of repetition, so extensive that deflection shooting bypassed conscious thought altogether, becoming ingrained at the same neurological level as innate actions, like walking or catching a thrown ball. Such intensive training, however, demanded a commitment of time and resources that the military simply could not afford during the initial, desperate years of 1942 and 1943. Nevertheless, by late 1944, with the Allied forces steadily gaining control of the air and training pipelines becoming more robustly established, gunnery schools were able to significantly extend their programs. The standard course, which had been a mere 4 weeks in 1942, was expanded first to 8 weeks, and then to a full 10 weeks. Students now expended 5,000 rounds during their training, a 5-fold increase from the previous allowance of 1,000 rounds. Crucially, over half of this increased ammunition expenditure was dedicated to engaging moving targets at speeds that realistically simulated actual combat conditions. The Naval Air Gunner School in Jacksonville, Florida, spearheaded a particularly innovative and highly effective training drill beginning in August 1944. They ingeniously mounted .50 caliber machine guns on motorized turrets capable of rapid spinning and elevation. High-speed boats were then employed to tow targets across the water at velocities reaching up to 60 miles per hour, while continuously varying their distance and crossing angles in a random fashion. Gunner trainees repeatedly engaged these dynamic targets, conducting between 50 and 70 passes per day, until the act of leading became an entirely automatic, instinctive response. Instructors deliberately refrained from offering verbal corrections during these drills. Instead, they simply allowed students to fire, observe their hit patterns, make their own adjustments, and then fire again. This method capitalized on the principle that the subconscious mind learns through immediate feedback loops far more rapidly and effectively than the conscious mind learns through explicit instruction. Analysis of combat footage revealed a truly remarkable characteristic among elite gunners who had successfully navigated 30 or more missions. Their deflection aim points remained steadfastly stable even under the most intense and life-threatening stress. When an FW-190 fighter screamed through a bomber formation, its cannons flashing menacingly from its wings, these seasoned gunners automatically maintained their precise lead. While their conscious minds might have been gripped by terror, many candidly admitted to being utterly convinced of their impending demise during certain engagements. Their hands instinctively sustained the correct sight picture. They had achieved a state akin to what martial artists describe as mushin, or no mind, where technique executes itself without conscious direction. Yet, attaining this profound level of proficiency demanded a significant investment of time and ammunition, resources that the vast majority of gunners never had the opportunity to receive. The logistical mathematics of wartime training were inherently brutal. If the development of a truly expert deflection shooter necessitated 5,000 practice rounds and 10 weeks of rigorous, intensive training, but the ongoing bomber offensive urgently required 50,000 new gunners within a mere 6-month timeframe, compromises were not just inevitable, but absolutely essential. Consequently, the overwhelming majority of gunners flying combat missions never attained true unconscious competence. They remained perpetually in the conscious competent stage, capable of executing proper deflection shooting when circumstances afforded them sufficient time for deliberate thought, but critically vulnerable to psychological collapse under extreme stress or when confronted with unforeseen and rapidly evolving tactical situations. This inherent disparity in training created a peculiar stratification in combat effectiveness across bomber formations. A formation's collective defensive firepower was far from uniform. It was heavily contingent upon the specific gunners manning specific positions on specific aircraft. A formation that fortuitously included several veterans with extensive, deeply ingrained training could often successfully repel attacks that would utterly devastate a formation composed primarily of newer, less experienced crews. German fighter pilots, astute observers of these combat dynamics, quickly learned to identify and exploit this vulnerability. They began to specifically target bombers that exhibited hesitant or inaccurate defensive fire during initial passes, while deliberately avoiding formations where the defensive fire was immediate, voluminous, and precisely placed. The transformative shift in deflection shooting, which originated from ingenious British experimentation and the urgent necessity faced by Americans, certainly did not conclude with the cessation of World War II in 1945. Instead, its fundamental tenet, the imperative to direct one's aim toward the anticipated future location of a target rather than its current position, became the cornerstone for every subsequent weapon system development. This foundational concept saw the Mark 14 computing gun sight evolve progressively into the Mark 18, a device that continued its service throughout the Korean War. Following this, it further morphed into sophisticated digital fire control computers, capable of analyzing and computing dozens of complex variables simultaneously, thereby dramatically enhancing precision and responsiveness. By the era of the Vietnam War, advanced fighter aircraft were routinely equipped with radar-assisted gun systems that automatically computed the necessary lead for deflection. This innovation necessitated merely that pilots maintain their targets within specific acquisition parameters, significantly simplifying the demanding task of manual aiming. The F-4 Phantom's lead computing optical sight system, for instance, could accomplish in mere microseconds what had previously consumed significant fractions of a second for Draper's earlier mechanical gyroscopes. While contemporary air-to-air combat has largely transcended the reliance on guns, with missiles now handling interception at ranges where accurate deflection would require leading by miles rather than feet, the fundamental principles of physics remain unaltered. Only the method of execution has changed. A modern IM-120 AMRAAM missile, utilizing inertial guidance and active radar, uninterruptedly refines its trajectory toward the target's projected position, executing these intricate deflection calculations thousands of times per second. Similarly, the F-22 Raptors and /APG-77 radar does more than just track targets. It forecasts their anticipated locations based on current velocity and acceleration, subsequently positioning the aircraft and selecting armaments accordingly. This represents the same complex problem that William Fleming addressed with rudimentary hand-drawn sketches in 1944, now managed by computers processing teraflops of data, a stark contrast to gunners who once relied on counting plane lengths. We invite you to stay with us and watch the end of the video. We would be grateful for your like and subscription. Please share a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. Intriguingly, the core tenets of deflection shooting persist within modern fighter pilot training curricula. Despite guns being subordinate armaments in contemporary aerial engagements, the esteemed Navy Fighter Weapons School, famously known as Top Gun, still imparts instruction on basic fighter maneuvers that include guns-only engagements. This practice is not predicated on the expectation that pilots will frequently engage in close-quarters aerial combat using projectile weapons, but rather because learning to visually predict the future position of a maneuvering target cultivates an acute perception of three-dimensional space, a spatial awareness that is applicable to every facet of air combat. A pilot who has mastered deflection shooting instinctively grasps closure rates, angle-off, and lead pursuit curves, concepts that hold immense importance whether one is discharging a cannon or positioning for an optimal missile shot. The profound lessons gleaned from this experience transcend the realm of aerial warfare, extending into any sphere encompassing fast-moving targets. Modern anti-aircraft systems, ranging from the Phalanx CIWS, which safeguards naval vessels, to the CRAM systems deployed to protect ground bases, are essentially highly advanced embodiments of the capabilities that 1943 bomber gunners once endeavored to perform by hand. The Phalanx, for example, unleashes 4,500 rounds per minute, equating to 75 rounds per second, at incoming missiles and aircraft. Its sophisticated radar system unremittingly computes deflection and refines the point of impact. It executes the precise corrections that Eddie Kowalski desperately needed over the Solomon Islands, but it does so with far greater speed and entirely devoid of the momentary human indecision that tragically claimed so many lives. Even digital entertainment, specifically video games that meticulously simulate combat scenarios, integrate the dynamics of deflection. These games impart to players the identical, initially perplexing axiom: one must aim where the target is projected to go. Titles such as War Thunder and Digital Combat Simulator, for instance, mandate that players anticipate the trajectory of moving targets manually. Consequently, new players often encounter the very same exasperation that 1942 gunners felt, observing their tracers pass harmlessly behind enemy aircraft until they assimilate the imperative of leading the target. The most skilled players, through practice, develop the same instinctive proficiency that combat veterans achieved, their hands recalibrating their sight picture without deliberate conscious thought. The profound shift from a mere 4% hit rate in early 1943 to an impressive over 20% by late 1944 stands as one of the most momentous operational advancements of World War II. This remarkable improvement was realized not by means of superior equipment or overwhelming numerical advantage, but rather through comprehending and aligning with the intricacies of human perception and processing, instead of contending against them. Thousands of air crewmen, who might otherwise have perished, continued their crucial missions. Enemy fighters that would have escaped were instead brought down in flames, and bombing campaigns that might have faltered ultimately reached their intended targets. All of this transpired because someone finally recognized the fallibility of human intuition, however strong it might feel, and understood that survival necessitated training individuals to disregard ingrained impulses and instead adhere to the dictates of physical laws. The gunners, who learned to aim at seemingly vacant air, who compelled themselves to discharge their weapons into nothing visibly tangible, and yet trusted their bullets would ultimately meet metal, demonstrated a fundamental truth about human adaptability under immense pressure. We are not irrevocably bound by our innate predispositions. With proper understanding, sufficient training, and a compelling degree of desperation, we possess the capacity to reconfigure our automatic reactions to align with objective reality, rather than stubbornly insisting that objective circumstances conform to our subjective perceptions. That invaluable lesson, forged in the crucible of conflict over the skies of Europe and the Pacific, retains its pertinence in any context where humans confront situations where instinct and the optimal solution point in diametrically opposite directions.